Well, today, I just want to wrap up this little two-part series that we called Playlist, Your Favorite Song Has More to Say. And last week we took an old song, and today I want to take a newer song. Let me also just highlight that after baptism service, we start our brand new series where we're going to be looking at happiness. Happiness. And the pursuit of happiness, I believe, is part of the founding ideas here. So we're going to look at what true happiness is, and we're going to do that through a series in the book of Philippians. And so in the back of your programs, you'll see all the upcoming titles, and you can see what to look forward to and perhaps who you might want to invite to come and join us here. All right, that's all my introductions out the way. Shall we start? Let's hear the song that we're going to base it on today. Just a little clip from a song. Maybe you've heard it on the radio. Let's cue the song.
Oh, it's such a shame that we don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore like we used to do. We don't laugh anymore. What was all of it for? Oh, we don't talk anymore like we used to do.
That song is by a guy with the great name of Charlie Puth. And it's featuring Selena Gomez. There you go. Take out your program notes that look like these and turn to the center pages. If you didn't get one, just get someone's attention. They'll hand you one and a pen. And you can also follow on the YouVersion Bible app if you wish. All the scriptures will appear on the screen and in the middle of your notes. Okay, the line in the song said, "We don't talk anymore like we used to." Have you noticed people have differences? Like people are different, people have differences, and differences often determine who we are and what we're like, and those are great and wonderful things, but you've discovered, I'm sure, that differences can also be dangerous, right? Because the differences that make us unique and make the world a wonderful place are also the same things that cause conflict. Like the differences between people is the place where the conflict arises. Now, we don't want to get rid of conflict by making everybody the same, right? It's not that we're searching for uniformity, like everyone has to be the same, everyone has to think the same, everyone has to look the same. That wouldn't be a great world. But we do try in our relationships to find a place of unity. And it can be a challenge to find unity in a relationship because often it's the differences that are dangerous. You could say it like this, like before, when you were single and you met someone that you liked, you could say it was the opposites that attract, right? It was the differences in the person that actually made you attracted to them. But then once you're married and a few years later, it's not opposites that attract, it's opposites that attack. And actually the things, some of the same things that you used to think were so cute, the way he chews his steak. And now you're like, would you stop chewing in my ear? That's so irritating. The way she used to laugh and giggle, and now her giggle's driving you nuts, right? Little things that you thought were great become the same things that now annoy you. Differences can be dangerous. So while we want to celebrate the diversity among us and celebrate the diversity in our families and in our churches, we want to recognize that there's often conflict. And when there's conflict, we get in the situation where we don't talk anymore like we used to. Let's look at our first verse from the Bible, Mark chapter 3 and verse 25. Jesus said this. He says, "If a family divides itself into groups which fight each other, that family will fall apart." Now, I don't need you to come up here and tell me a testimony, but I know there are testimonies among us who could say, yeah, sadly, that's my family. Got a broken family, a family that fell apart because we were fighting with each other. And what happens is you get these unresolved differences that lead to fights, and then the fights lead to offenses, and it sort of tears relationships apart. It's true for families, it's true for work environments, it's true for churches. By the way, the church is a family. The church is not just like a family, the church is a family. We belong to each other. And if we allow fights, and if we allow quarrels to divide us, then Jesus says, will eventually fall apart. Now, what is it that causes fights and quarrels? What is it that is the actual cause of conflict in our families? Let's look at James chapter 4 and verse 1. He says this. He asks the question, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Good question. He gives us the answer. Aren't they caused by the selfish desires that fight to control you? It's the selfish desires. Let me show you the same verse in another version of the Bible, the Message paraphrase. He says, where do you think all these appalling wars and quarrels come from? Do you think they just happen? No, think again. They come about because you want your own way. And you'll fight for it deep inside yourself. He's saying that the reason that differences are dangerous, the reason that quarrels and fights don't just happen, the Bible says it's a clear root, and that root is selfishness. I sort of joke about this sometimes, but I say, like, I can save you a fortune in marriage counseling. I'll save you a lot of money. If you come see me, I'll just tell you this. Stop being selfish. Because that's pretty much what it usually comes down to. Right? Grow up and stop being selfish. It's these conflicting desires. I have desire and you have desire, and they're conflicting. And it causes division. Now, think of the word division. It actually comes from two words put together. Division. Two visions. Division is the tearing apart of vision. And that happens in relationships, and sadly it happens in churches too. In churches, when the churches are not united in their vision, people start trying to get their own way. And what is the root of that? It is selfishness. Now, there is a letter in the Bible named after the half-brother of Jesus. It's the letter of Jude. It's one of the small ones. And in verse 18, he says this. Jude, verse 18. He says, in the last days there will be people who will make a religion of their own whims and lusts. These are the ones who split churches. Look at this. Thinking only of themselves. He says there are people in churches who will split churches, and the reason they do it is they start to make a religion out of their own desire. They start to make a religion out of the way they want it to be. Now, do all differences lead us to division? No, of course not. So why do some? And the reason simply is that differences lead to division when we maximize the differences and minimize the vision. When we get away from the thing that is core to what we all have and all agree on and start majoring on the minors, or as I like to say, get caught in the thick of thin things. Right? That's what the Pharisees love to do, to get caught in the thick of thin things, the minutiae of the details, and missing what we have in common, which is so beautiful. So the opportunity for fighting is always going to be there. The opportunity to be offended. You know, we live in a culture of offense these days where everyone wants to be the victim. We're now glorifying victimhood. It's a race to the bottom. And so there's always going to be that opportunity to feel offended. And by the way, the longer you know someone, the more reason you have to fight with them. Think about it. I'm not saying it always happens, but if you follow the logic of this, is that the longer you're married, the more you realize how different you are from one another, then that provides more opportunity for fighting. Now, marriage, or let's say maturity in marriage, is when you can learn to appreciate the differences in one another and value the differences rather than trying to impose the need for change on the other person. So like when you start out in a marriage or in a new relationship, people argue over stuff like, should the towels be folded in halves or in thirds? Right? Critical things like that. Or, should the toilet roll fold over or under? Let's have a quick vote on that. You could settle an issue for me. You know what I mean? To toilet roll over or under? Okay, let's go. Raise your hand for under. Anyone for an under? See you later. See you later. Over. Anyone for over? The overs have it. Democracy wins again. Some apologies will be needed in my house. Well, anyway, critical issues like those. When people get into relationships, the reason in the beginning is they do so because they want to have their needs met. Now let's just be honest about that. You just got to be, let's not pretend. We get into a relationship because we want to have our needs met. And what happens is relationships start to fall apart when we decide that the other person is no longer meeting our needs. So it's like, well, you don't meet the needs that you used to meet, so you can be discarded and we'll get someone else who will meet those needs. Isn't that a very selfish way to view life and relationships? And that will always lead to fights and quarrels. You're not meeting my needs. So today I want to talk a bit about how we resolve conflict and how we look at our differences and come to reconciliation. But to begin with, let's talk about some of the ways that we typically respond to conflict. Now, Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 19. This is from the Message because, sometimes when you cover verses that people know very well, like you can read something and you go, oh yeah, I've heard that. So sometimes I just throw you another translation because it makes you think a little more. So in this version, Jesus says it like this. He says, it's from the heart that we vomit up evil arguments. I love that. Colorful, let's call it colorful language. Because selfishness is like this. Selfishness conjures up the images of being sick. It's repulsive. Selfish people make you want to vomit. And that's what he's talking about here, is that is from their hearts that up comes the stuff. And I want you to notice that he calls it evil arguments. And the reason I point that out is because there are healthy arguments. Listen, there's a difference between healthy arguments and evil arguments. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. The root of selfishness. Speaking about those kinds of people, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to a young man called Timothy. And in 1 Timothy 6, verse 4, he speaks about these kinds of people. And he says, tag them for what they are. Ignorant windbags who infect the air with germs of envy, controversy, bad-mouthing, suspicious rumors, till eventually there's an epidemic of backstabbing, and the truth is but a distant memory. I don't know if I think he's talking about Washington, D.C. here. But notice how this starts. What he's saying is selfish people, they cause divisions, and then the divisions spread like a disease. Look at the language of disease he's using here. And he makes a little list of some of the things. He says enviousness and controversy, bad-mouthing and rumors or gossip. And all of these things, the beginning of them is selfishness. Right? So we're envious and jealous of other people because we think of how much they have and how little we have. And what is that? Selfish. We stir up controversy when we don't like people or the things that they say. What is that? Selfish. We sort of badmouth people and we gossip about them because they get attention and we don't. What's that? Selfish. We spread rumors and gossip. We lust for that juicy drama. What is that? That's selfishness. It's all selfishness. In Galatians 5 verse 17, Paul again says this, for there is a root of sinful self-interest in us. Can we just be honest about that? Can we acknowledge that about ourselves this morning? There is a root of sinful self-interest in us. And that is at odds with a free spirit. Just as the free spirit is incompatible with selfishness. These two ways of life are antithetical, so that you cannot live at times one way and at times another way according to how you feel on any given day. Boy, do I want to preach about that right now. He's saying there is a war between us, inside of us, a war between us, between the selfish spirit and the free spirit, between the flesh and the Spirit of God. And every day, at every moment, you have to make choices. That's what it comes down to. That at every opportunity you are provided with a choice. Will you go with your selfish, sinful spirit, or will you go with what you know is right, which is testified to you by the Spirit of Jesus that lives inside of you? And the sum of those choices will determine the direction of your life. It's not to say that you won't go one way sometimes and one way the other, but which side wins? Where are you making the largest number of deposits? Because if you make more choices towards the sinful flesh, you reap decay and death. And if you reap more towards your spirit, you reap eternal life. But look how he ends that verse. You can't live at times one way and another, depending on how you feel on any given day. You've probably known somebody, don't look at them, but you've probably known somebody where on any given day, you don't know what you're going to get. A capricious person, a person who you like, let's see what side of the bed they got out of this day. Maybe it's a boss or someone at work. Maybe it's a family member, and you sort of tiptoe around them until you find out whether they've had their coffee or not, right? It's like, which is it, Jekyll and Hyde today? And he says you can't live your life by how you feel. Now that's contrary to what people were trying to tell you today. Follow your heart. Just be true to yourself. Like all this stuff, it sounds good, right? But it's mumbo jumbo. It makes no real sense. And if you try it, I promise you, it'll go bad. Don't just follow your heart. If you follow your heart, you'll make many, many bad decisions because your heart is deceitful. And if you go based on your feelings, that's what he's talking about, you can't just live by how you feel on any given day. That's why people who follow Jesus have to follow by faith. In other words, you make decisions based on what you know to be true, not based on how you feel in the moment. Because your emotions can rise and fall based on your circumstances, but you never want to attach your sense of happiness, joy, self-worth, or contentment. Don't ever attach them to your circumstances. Because your circumstances can rise and they can fall. In any given day, within 1 hour, they can rise and fall. And if you attach your happiness to that, it'll go up and it'll go down. You got to root it in something that's never changing, which is the truth of Christ's love for you and the truth that is recorded in the Scriptures. In James chapter 3 and verse 16, he says, whenever you're trying to look better than others or get the better of others, things fall apart and everyone ends up at each other's throats. But real wisdom, God's wisdom, begins with a holy life. And it is characterized by getting along with others. Look at this. You say, hey, Fraser, what's the sign of a mature Christian? Is it how many services they attend on the weekend? Is it if they go to small group? What's a mature person? The person who teaches in the kids' ministry? Is it the person who tithes their income? What is it, Fraser? How do we know? Who is really spiritually mature? And he says it is characterized by getting along with others. Right? You can come to church every week, but if you're a cantankerous old bism, and no one likes you, and your own family don't even want to speak to you, then of what good is your tithe? Of what good is how many verses you've memorized? He goes on about this life. It is characterized, he says, it is gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings. And here we go again. Not hot one day and cold the next, and not two-faced. You can develop a healthy and robust community that lives right with God and enjoy its results only if you do the hard work of getting along with each other, treating each other with dignity and honor. I love how the Bible is so honest. I love how it says here, do the hard work of getting along with each other. Isn't it hard work? Isn't it hard just to be with people? Isn't relationships always work? And so let's look at 5 typical responses to conflict, right? Let's imagine there are 5 ways that people typically respond. You can write these in on your notes. The first way we're going to call my way. We're having conflict, and the way I'm going to choose to respond is, it's going to go my way. Now, are you that person? Are you the kind of person who finds it hard to give in? Like you just can't back down. You're not going to apologize, and you're not going to concede anything. It's my way. Because, this is the most common one. The most common response, the selfishness, when facing conflict says, it's going to go my way, and I will not be satisfied until it's 100% my way. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, it says, practically everything that goes on in the world, wanting your own way, wanting everything for yourself, wanting to appear important, has nothing to do with the Father. In fact, he says, it just isolates you from him. This idea of my way, it's my way. That's what's going to happen. And there's not going to be an argument about it. We're going to do it my way. And there's a word for that sense. We call that ego, don't we? A sense of ego. It's my way. But he says that whenever you act like that, it's nothing to do with God, and it separates you from God. Actually, saying my way distances you from God. It's called your ego, and so I'm going to call that easing God out. That's what he says, is whenever you go by your ego, you separate and isolate from God. You ease God out. My way. The second common response to conflict we'll call no way. The no way person is the person who doesn't even want to engage. This is the person who retreats at any sign of conflict. Anything at all for peace is that person's model. It's like, I just hate it so much, I'm not even going to deal with it. We're not even going to talk about it. We'll just pretend it never happened. The reason people do that often is because they have low self-esteem. And it's a way to try and protect themselves. They don't want to be hurt. But in a way, you think about it, that's still focusing on yourself. So like in Romans 8, it says this, focusing on the self is the opposite of focusing on God. Anyone completely absorbed in self ignores God, ends up thinking more about self than God, and that person ignores who God is and what he's doing. So actually, avoiding conflict entirely because you're trying to protect yourself is still self-focused. So there's my way, there's no way. Then number 3 is your way. And this person is the capitulator. This person is the way who says, oh, you just have it your way. And I don't mean that in a like pretend arrogant way, like, well fine, you just have it your way then. No, I mean a genuine capitulator. I mean a person who just always gives in. And why does that person do that? Well, in part because they want to win the approval of others. The person that always gives in is the person who has an insecurity. They just roll over and play dead, and they just let people walk all over them. Yeah, whatever you want. But listen, the person who does that, and if you're in a relationship with a person who does that, and you always use your little techniques to make sure that they always give in to you, can I warn you that the person who always gives in is building up bitterness and resentment? If you always give in, and you just always let everyone have their own way, you're building up this resentment, and it'll pop at some point. I've seen it happen many times. In Galatians chapter 1, the writer says this, I'm not trying to please people. I want to please God. Do you think I'm trying to please people? If I were doing that, I wouldn't be a servant of Christ. In other words, don't be such a people pleaser that you'll avoid conflict or you just give in all the time. Again, Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 11. He says, I am told that you can't get along with each other when you worship, and I'm sure that some of what I've heard is true. You are bound to argue with each other, but it is easy to see which of you have God's approval. In other words, conflicts are inevitable, but you don't want to be the person who, in trying to gain everyone else's approval, never stands up for what's right. Which leads to the fourth way that people do it. Number 4 is halfway. Now, are you the kind of person who's always looking for the compromise? I'll meet you halfway, right? So you want this and I want that, so let's compromise. Maybe you make a political approach, right? Or the diplomatic approach to conflict. And let me say this, that's good sometimes. That is a good thing to do. Sometimes making a compromise is a good thing to do. But listen, it is not always the right thing to do. It's better than the first 3, but it is not always a way to guarantee success. And you say, well, why not? Because the problem is sometimes it leads us to compromise in the wrong things. You should not compromise if in compromising it leads you to disobey God's word. You shouldn't compromise if it forces you to go against your values. If you're a young person and you're not married, you're dating a man or a woman, and they're pressuring you to break your integrity and the values that you hold, and you say, well, I'll compromise. And I'll go halfway. That's not a good idea. If you have a boss, someone at work who's trying to get you to act in a way that is immoral, unethical, or even breaking the law, it's not for you to say, well, let's compromise, I'll meet you halfway. Because for you, halfway, let me say it like this. For you, a half-truth is a full lie. Man, that was good. A half-truth is a full lie. So compromise is not always the right way. So there's my way, no way, your way, halfway. But number 5 is God's way. There is a biblical way of sorting out our differences, and it has nothing to do with selfishness. In fact, as we're going to see, it is the complete opposite of selfishness. It's looking out for other people's interests first. Let me read to you Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Don't do anything from selfish ambition or from a cheap desire to boast, but be humble toward one another, always considering others better than yourselves, and look out for one another's interests, not just for your own. The attitude that you should have is the one that Christ Jesus had. You see, the opposite of selfishness is selflessness. But you got to try and get this right too, because trying to be selfless doesn't mean that you just treat yourself without worth. It doesn't mean that you walk around saying, well, I'm just a nobody, I'm a nothing, I'm beneath everyone else. And when it says, think of people, put other people first, that doesn't mean that you don't look after yourself or have self-care. That's not what it's saying. Let's get this right. But being selfless doesn't mean that you think less of yourself. It means you think of yourself less. I'm here to preach today. It doesn't mean thinking less of yourself. It means thinking of yourself less. Jesus didn't come to die for junk. You're not junk. You don't have to live like that. And so God has a way. And before I give you the practical steps on how to resolve conflict, just so you know that we're all the same, we all face the same things. Let me characterize 3 games that we play in conflict. And you can write these in on your notes. There's sort of 3 games that we play, 3 scenarios that we create when we're having arguments. And I want you to think about your house in times of conflict and see if any of this makes sense for you. The first one, write this in, we're going to call it the stage. The stage. And the stage, when it comes to conflict, is the scenario where everyone is an actor and has a role to play. Right? And think about your family and conflicts that have happened. And suddenly there's an argument broke out, and it's as if we're all actors in a play. And we all have different masks that we find ourselves wearing. For example, let me try and help you. Like dads, they often feel like they have to wear the sort it out, no problem mask. Right? That's like the dad thinks that's his role as the actor in the current situation. His role is to sort it out, no problem. Just fix it. That's what he thinks is his role. Maybe one of the kids, they think that their role is to try and get between people and get the peace. But it's like everyone has a role. Everyone has an act that they are to perform. And sometimes people even have a costume. And what happens is when you're in the scene and everyone's playing their part. And listen, if you've had enough conflict over the years, you'll begin to see the patterns. Everyone develops a certain habit. But what happens then is you hardly ever listen. Because you've got your role to play. So you're trying to think about how your lines, I'm working this metaphor, right? You're thinking about your lines and you're waiting for your cues. And so in doing so, you're not actually really listening to one another. And you've set the stage. You say, well, what do you mean by people taking on roles? What do you mean acting? Well, I like to keep it real. So here's what I've seen. Sometimes people feel like they ought to look as if they're undamaged or that they're stronger than they really are. What's that? That's acting. That's a role. There's a conflict broken out. There's an argument in the house, and someone feels like they have to act like they're untouched by it. They have to act like what you just said didn't hurt them, even though it did. But the opposite is also true. I've seen it where you get people who manipulate the situation by being overly emotional in their responses, being overloaded with the melodramatics. What is that? That's acting. I'm going to overplay this situation. And we set the stage. In James chapter 3, verse 16, he says, whenever you're trying to look better than others, we read this, or get the better of others, things fall apart and everyone ends up at each other's throats. That's what happens when you're acting. And then at the end, we read this earlier, he said, not one day and cold the next, but not two-faced. And the reason I put the verse in a second time is because the idea of two-faced, if we knew someone we thought was two-faced, we'd call them a hypocrite. That guy, he's a hypocrite. He's one thing and one thing another. And the word hypocrite is a Greek word that comes from the word of the stage. Back in those days, they'd put on these plays or performances, and sometimes there was only 2 actors or 3 actors in the whole performance. And what they'd do is they'd jump offside, and they'd put a mask on their face, and they'd come out and they would play a role. Then they'd change mask and play a different role. So they had different masks for different situations, and those actors were called the hypocrites. So when you're two-faced in your conflict, when you set the stage and you're acting, here's the second scene, the second game we play. I'm going to call it the courtroom. The courtroom. And the courtroom for conflict is when people feel like the whole situation is a trial. And you got the prosecutor and the defendant. And the person, when there's a conflict, one person thinks it's their job to defend themselves. And so they offer all their arguments. But this and then that. But you don't understand because this happened and that happened. And he said this and this. And the other person, well, they feel like it's their job, listen, to spot a hole in the argument. No. Wait a minute. You just said, but previously you said this, and that doesn't match with that. And then maybe there's someone else in the room, and their room is to say objection, sustained, overruled. And so the whole conflict in the family has become like the courtroom. Provide your evidence. Provide your counter evidence. And who's going to be the judge? Jesus talks about like this in Luke chapter 12, verse 58. He says, if someone brings a lawsuit against you and takes you to court, he says, do your best to settle the dispute before you get to court. In other words, there is a way to resolve conflict that doesn't involve the courtroom scenario. In fact, let me read this longer passage. Paul instructs in 1 Corinthians 6. Maybe this is relevant to someone. He says, if any of you have a dispute with another Christian, how dare you go before heathen judges instead of letting God's people settle the matter? Don't you know that God's people will judge the world? Well then, if you are to judge the world, aren't you capable of judging small matters? Do you know that we shall judge the angels? How much more then the things of this life? If such matters come up, are you going to take them to be settled by people who have no standing in the church? Shame on you. Surely there is at least one wise person in your fellowship who can settle a dispute between fellow Christians. Instead, one Christian goes to the court against another and lets unbelieving judges judge the case. The very fact that you have legal disputes among you shows that you have failed completely. Would it not be better for you to have been wronged? Would it not be better for you to be robbed? But instead, you yourselves wrong one another and rob one another, even other believers. That's a strong passage in which he's saying that Christians shouldn't take other Christians to court, and that we in the church should resolve these matters. So the courtroom, and the last of the games we play, we'll call the war zone. The war zone. And when it comes to conflict, the war zone, well, that's the time that you get to pull out the big weapons. This is when the artillery comes out. This is when you get to pull out your gun that you've been, metaphorically, that you've kept polished for such an occasion as this. Some ammo that you've actually been storing. You've been storing it for weeks, waiting for the chance to bring it out. What is the war zone? The war zone is things like the weapon of your past mistakes, the weapon of personal attacks, the weapons of name calling, the weapons of careless and spiteful retaliation. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, Jesus says, don't pick on people, jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. And isn't that so good? Because isn't that what happens? See, conflict escalates. So if you bring out a weapon, they're going to bring out another weapon, probably bigger than yours. So then you'll need to respond with an even bigger weapon. And eventually it just becomes a case of, if I don't have a good point to make, I'll just make it very loudly. Don't look at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm losing this argument, so I'm going to start raising my voice louder and louder. Because the one who yells the loudest wins. That's what happens in our families. In 2 Corinthians 5:17, he says, anyone who belongs to Christ is a new person. Their past is forgotten, and everything is new. And if you're bringing out the weapon of someone's past, listen, if you're married or in a relationship and the other partner made some terrible mistake some months, years ago, but every time you have an argument, you bring it back up to them. Like, oh really? Like the time when you did that, 5 years ago, remember? Huh? Can I just tell you, the thing that is ruining your relationship is not what they did 5 years ago. It's the fact that you keep bringing it up. That's what's ruining it. The big weapons. So let's finish with some practical. What do we do to sort out our differences? Let me give you 4 things. Number 1, the first thing we need is forgiveness. We need forgiveness to sort out our differences. And it starts with God. You need to know the forgiveness of God in your own life, because you are incapable of giving people a forgiveness that you've never received. And so if you've never given your life to Christ, that's how it starts, by receiving the forgiveness of God for your own sins. And when you do that, and you begin to realize that you yourself are a person who needs forgiveness, then how can you withhold forgiveness from someone else? In Ephesians 2, verse 16, Paul says, as parts of the same body, our anger against each other has disappeared. For both of us have been reconciled to God. And so the feud ended at the cross. If you are in a Christian relationship, you are reconciled to God, and he is reconciled to God, or she is reconciled to God. And as two people reconciled to God, the conflict is over. Two Christians who disagree or are at odds with each other have to first remember that Jesus has dealt with the problem by bridging the gap. One of my favorite writers is a German man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Recommend his books to you. I've sat at his desk in Berlin. He was a pastor theologian in the Second World War. He was part of an attempt to assassinate Hitler. And he said this. So this was his marriage advice to some newlyweds. He said this: live together in forgiveness, for without it no human relationship, least of all a marriage, can survive. Accept each other as you are, and forgive each other every day from the bottom of your hearts. And he wrote that from a German death camp, where shortly after he would die. Forgiveness. And so here's what I challenge you to do. I challenge you to make a decision in your heart towards the people that you love the most, that you will live in a perpetual flow of forgiveness. That you have chosen now to forgive them of things that are still to happen. Because here's what we usually do. We wait till stuff happens and then we decide if we're going to forgive. And that's not what God does with us. So I challenge you to make a decision right now that you have already forgiven them of stuff that hasn't even happened yet. So that when it happens, and it inevitably will, that you will no longer have a decision to make. You understand me? Because in that moment, you'll be full of emotion, full of hurt, and you'll be making decisions. Make a decision now that no matter what they do, you will forgive them. That reminds me of a story, and I just put a little of it on the screen, but I think it's worth the time to read the whole story. It's called The Parable of the Unmerciful Servant. I'll read it. Peter came up to the Lord and he said, how many times should I forgive someone who does something wrong to me? Is it 7 times enough? And Jesus answered, not just 7 times, but 77 times. This story will show you what the kingdom of heaven is like. Bear with me as I read the story. He says, one day a king decided to call in his officials and ask them to give an account of what they owed him. And as he was doing this, one official was brought in who owed him 50 million silver coins. But he didn't have enough money to pay what he owed. The king ordered him to be sold, along with his wife and children and all he owned, in order to pay the debt. But the official got down on his knees and he began begging, have pity on me. I'll pay you every cent that I owe. The king felt sorry for him and let him go free. And he even told the official that he didn't have to pay back the money. As the official was leaving, he happened to meet another official who owed him 100 silver coins. And so he grabbed the man by the throat and he started choking him. And he said, pay me what you owe. The man got down on his knees and he began begging, have pity on me. I'll pay you back every cent. But the first official refused to have pity. And instead he went and he had the other official put in jail until he could pay what he owed. When some other officials found out what had happened, they felt sorry for the man who'd been put in jail. And they told the king what had happened. The king called the first official back and he said, you are an evil man. When you begged for mercy, I said you didn't have to pay what you owed. Don't you think you should show pity to someone else as I did to you? The king was so angry that he ordered the official to be tortured until he could pay back everything he owed. And here's the kicker. Jesus says, this is how my Father in heaven will treat you if you don't forgive each other from your heart. Mic drop right there. One of the key lines in here is at the beginning, when the man who owed the big amount of money, it said he didn't have enough money to pay what he owed. Listen to me very clearly. Your husband, your wife, your mother, your sister, your friend, they do not have enough to pay you. They don't have enough to pay you back for the way that they've hurt you. They don't have enough. And so if you're expecting it from them, you will always be disappointed. They don't have enough to make up for it. And so how can you withhold your forgiveness? A small debt that they owe you compared to the great debt that you have owed God. I better move on. Number 2. So we need forgiveness. The second thing we need is forthrightness. Forthrightness, which means the ability to speak the truth. And a lot of people are uncomfortable speaking the truth. Some people struggle with honesty in relationships. I read this funny little story. It was about this author was writing the biography for this very wealthy woman. And as they dug into her story, they found out that one of her grandfathers had been executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in New York. Right? So they'd been doing this research, and this very wealthy woman whose biography, she didn't want that story to be in her book. She didn't want that negative part of her family's history. So the author used a little creative journalism, and this is what he wrote. One of her grandfathers occupied the chair of applied electricity in one of America's best-known institutions. See, we can twist words to mean anything. But we have to be honest if we're going to resolve conflict. We got to speak the truth and do it in love. In Proverbs 27 verse 5, it says, it is better to correct someone openly than to let them think you don't care for them at all. So avoiding the truth, you might think, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. And he's saying you hurt them more because they feel like you don't even care. This is scary for the no way people who just want to avoid it all. So Jesus gives us a biblical way to resolve conflict. Matthew 18 is the famous chapter. Verse 15, he says, if your brother sins against you, go to him and show him his fault. But do it privately between yourselves. And if he listens to you, you've won your brother back. But if he won't listen to you, then take 1 or 2 other persons with you so that every accusation may be upheld by the testimony of 2 or more witnesses. And if he will still not listen, then tell the whole church. This is how you're supposed to do it. Let me just put it in plain terms. If you have personal sins, you deal with them personally. If the person will not respond, if they won't listen, if there's no progression, he says, then take another person with you. Take someone else from church, someone who's spiritual, someone who's mature, and try again. And if they still won't listen, you can take it to the church for help. Now, let me be clear about that last step. And actually, let me make this real practical. Don't come running to me too soon. Right? Because this happens. People come to me and things have happened and they want me to get involved. And I always ask them, have you spoken to them yourself? Well, no, I was hoping you'd come with me. Not yet. Not yet. Go and deal with it yourself. And if it doesn't go well, someone else from church can come and try and help you. And if it still doesn't go well, then maybe you bring me in, or the elders. But even then, listen, that last step is not there to embarrass people. It's not about public shame. It's about trying to win people. That's why we do it. Because we care and we try to win them over to truth. So we need forthrightness. Number three is we need fortitude. And what is fortitude? Well, it's staying power. It's keeping going, right? And we need that if we're going to resolve conflict. And so I really believe that we should never give up on people. Never give up on people. I want to talk about that one day, about when people are deep involved in something that is wrong and it gets exposed. Don't give up on them. You see what happened? I don't have time. I'll do it another time. But we shouldn't give up on people. Let's just move on. Number four, we need forfeiture to sort out our differences. What do I mean by that? You got to forfeit certain rights. If you're going to resolve a conflict, you got to give up certain things. And there are a few, you can quickly write these in. The first thing you need to forfeit is your right to weapons. I just read about New Zealand. I used to live in New Zealand. And I just read that they had an amnesty of weapons in Christchurch where I lived. And they said that people came and handed in 10,000 weapons. It was frightening to think there were 10,000 weapons in the city. People handed them in. And when it comes to conflict, you need to forfeit your right to your weapons. The weapons that I mentioned before, like bringing up the past. The weapons of calling people names. The weapons of saying the things that you know hurt them the most. You know, taking a person who's confessed a certain insecurity that they have, and then you turn around and use it against them. Well, you know you're just like your father. That's a stab for some people. You can't just go throwing that around. Right? Stuff like that, using their insecurities against them. Forfeit your right to weapons. Ephesians 4:31 says, stop being mean, bad-tempered and angry, quarreling, harsh words, and the dislike of others. They should have no place in our lives. Don't bring out the weapons. Second thing you have to forfeit is your wishes. Forfeit your wishes, which is our attempt to get our own way, attempt to have our needs met. Listen, if you're trying to get your needs met from someone else, you'll always be disappointed. Why don't you try and meet their needs? Because that's what happens, is the more you try to meet their needs, the more they reciprocate. But if it's just a war between two people trying to get their own way, it never goes well at all. Philippians 2 says, don't be selfish. Don't just think about your own affairs, but be interested in others too. And then the last one, this might surprise you. You have to forfeit your right to worship. What do you mean? What, I have to give up worship? Let me show you what Jesus says in Matthew 5. He says, if you're about to offer your gift to God at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Go at once and make peace with your brother, and then come back and offer your gift to God. In other words, to put it in our context, he's like, if you're come to worship God, if you're going to take communion, if you're on your way to your small group Bible study, and you're trying to be holy and righteous, and you're going to pray and sing and worship God, but in your heart you know there's conflict with someone else, look how highly God values this. God says, lay aside your worship and go fix your relationship first. And then when it's fixed, your heart will be clean to worship me. That's how highly God values these things. Abandon the altar and fix your relationships. Let's have the band come up together. I know I went over time today. I hope that you gained something practical from it. I want to pray with you as we close. Let's pray. Lord, forgive me for my wandering thoughts today. I pray that something from your word was helpful to people. Lord, because of sin in the world, there's conflict. Because of the sinful and selfish desires we have, we quarrel and argue. And so we ask your forgiveness, and we ask that you give us wisdom. Lord, so much of this is about practical skills. It's about learning how to do the hard work of relationships. And often no one teaches us. You don't get it in school. Many of us grew up in dysfunctional families where our parents didn't even know how to fight fair. And so I thank you for your word, and I thank you for this church, and that we can talk honestly about real issues. And so, Lord, I want to pray for any families present who are having a time of conflict right now, that you would enable them to fight fair, to put away these weapons that we've discussed, and to speak honestly and fairly, fighting for and not against. And I pray this now in the name of Jesus. Amen. We're going to worship one more time. Let's